Hi, I'm Jenny from the Missouri Star Quilt Company, and I've got a great project for you today. I love what happens when you combine two blocks to make a whole new pattern, and this is one of those fun times. So to make this quilt behind me, what we're going to be doing is we're going to make a fence rail block and a 9-patch block. Then we're going to put a background square in there, and we get this gorgeous quilt. So let's take a look at this. So we've got a row here where we've combined both blocks, and a row where we've used the fence rails to border our background squares. So let me show you how to do this. So to make this quilt, what you're going to need is 1 packet of 10-inch pre-cut squares, and we've used Perfectly Seasoned by Sandy Gervais. It's just a gorgeous rich line. I just think it's so pretty. And then you're also going to need 1.25 yards of background fabric. That's going to make these little 6-inch squares here and your borders. And then you're going to need 1.25 yards for your outer border as well. And it just makes this really fun project. So what we're going to do to make this quilt is we are going to make 2 different blocks. So you get twice the bang for your buck with this one because you'll learn 2 different techniques. We're going to make a fence rail and we're going to make a 9-patch. And we're going to do that by taking our 10-inch squares, and what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to separate them into lights and darks. And I have 2 squares here, and we're going to put our lights and darks together. And it can be lights and darks or it can be contrast. You just need to make sure you have good contrast between these. And we're going to cut them at the same time. And what we're going to do is we're going to make sure they're perfectly lined up with each other, and then we're going to cut the whole thing into 2.5-inch strips. So we're going to lay our ruler on here, and you have to be pretty careful with the 2.5-inch strips because you don't want to end up with a short one on the end because you're going to need all these to make both blocks. So let's go ahead and cut this. All right, there's one. Now we're on to the next one. You want to get 4 sets of these out of each square. So make sure you stay lined up pretty good. There's the next one, and 1 more set. And then I'm just going to check this one to make sure it is still 2.5. And it is. We did it. You know, when I make these things, I generally try to go through and find the parts that I think that you need to pay attention to and that are going to that could give you possible, you know, a little bit of stress. And that was one of those things. You have to make sure that you really do get a good measurement on your blocks because you want 4 strips. So now what we're going to do with these is we're going to sew some strip sets together. And we're going to sew 1 set where we have 2 darks and a light like this, and 1 set where we have 2 lights like this and a dark in the middle. And then we're going to save these 2 for later. So we're going to sew these 2 different strip sets. Make sure you have 2 lights and a dark, 2 darks and a light. We're just going to fold them right over on each other and sew them down. And we can even chain sew these if you'd like. So we'll head to the sewing machine. And I'm just going to lay that presser foot down along that edge. I've got my 1/4 inch lined up. And we're just going to sail down the side. I'm going to grab 2 more before I cut this. And sail down that one. Now, depending upon where I put this next strip and what strip I use, it's going to give me my 2 lights and my 2 darks. So I'm going to iron this open with my dark on top, roll it back, and then this is the one I'm going to add the dark to the other side. So let's go ahead and go over and do that, okay? Here we go. And sew down that. And then I'm going to press this one open. And I've got my dark on top, set my seam, roll it back. All right, so now I have this set done. Now with the other one that I started where it's got it's the same dark and light, I'm going to put my light on the other side of the dark right here. So just like that, you're going to have 2 sets. We're going to lay this one over and sew 1/4 inch right down the side.
I'll
Alrighty, let's line those up. I always take a few little anchoring stitches, then I line them up, and then I just sail down that side. All right, now what we're going to do is we're still going to press to the dark side, so we keep our dark on top, but we're going to lift this up and roll it back that way. So now these seams should go toward the middle. So these seams should go toward the middle, and these seams should go outside. So that's really how you want to press those to make sure that this is going to lay together nice. All right, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take these sets, we're going to measure how tall they are, and they should be 6.5, pretty close to it. And then we're going to cut a 6.5 square out of that. So that will make our fence rail block. So let's count over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.5. And make sure that's all lined up good. Straight on the ruler, straight on the mat. 6.5. And there's our first square. And then we're going to do the same thing with this one. So I like to line those up so that I know I'm on the right. This, you know, one of the things I want to show you right here real quick is make sure that you have no pleats right here in your seams, that when you've ironed it, it's completely flat, because that will change the size of your block, and that will matter in this. So we're going to come over 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.5, and cut our next block. Make sure it stays lined up. And there we go. We're looking for squares here. That's why we measure how tall it is and cut it that wide. So we have 2 blocks now that are 6.5, and our fence rail part is done. This is a fence rail block, and it is done. So we're going to stack those over here, and now we're going to make the 9-patch block. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and trim these to 2.5. And we have this tiny little bit of waste. We don't worry about that. And trim this one to 2.5. Like this. And then we need to set these over here, and we're going to look at these 2 strips that we set off to the side. So I have 2 strips here now, and we're going to lay them right on top of each other, and I'm going to cut the whole bunch of these into 2.5-inch squares. So here we go. I'll just slide those up. Keep that straight on there, because this is going to make our other little part of our 9-patch. There we go. All right, now we have actually, because I have them stacked 2, we have 8 2.5-inch squares. To finish off our 9-patch here, what we're going to do is we are going to take 2 of these like this, and wait, a dark. So we're going to stack our squares up, and we're going to get what we need to finish our 9-patch, which for this one it's going to be 2 darks and a light. We're going to sew this row together, then we're going to attach these rows together, and that will make our 9-patch. So let's go over to the sewing machine and sew this little row together, because we want to press him before we sew it on. So we're going to sew, take a light patch and sew a green 2.5-inch square to either side of that. There's one. I'm going to open this up, and we're going to sew the green to the other side. Okay. So now we've got this last piece all sewn together, and I actually flipped over my other piece that had the 2 darks on it to make sure I'm pressing the same way. Because if you press the same way, then when you go to put these 2 together, those seams are going to nest right up, and you're going to have perfect little corners. So we're going to lay this in here. I like to match up my edges and make sure that this nests. See how this nests right here? And you can see that those seams are going to line right up. It's going to be perfect. So let's sew these together, 1/4 inch. Make sure we're all lined up. You get to the point where you can really feel if it's nesting good with your finger. I don't know if you've noticed, but I don't use a lot of pins because I can feel it with my fingers. So now we're going to add this other one to the other sides. Make sure they checkerboard. Make sure you're adding it to the right side. And we're going to stitch that down. Alrighty. All right, so let's open this up and iron it. Take a look at it. Now I do like to iron from the top to make sure there are no folds in my seams, and then you can flip that over and make sure your seams go the way you want to, which once your block is done, it doesn't matter. All right, so there's our little 9 patch. So that's how you make these 2 blocks. So once you get your blocks done, you're going to do that to your whole layer cake. You're just going to go ahead and cut the whole thing up, cut your 4 strips, put them together in fence rail blocks, then make those make what's left over into the 9 patch blocks. You're going to need 20 of the 9 patches and 31 of the fence rails. Then you're going to take your background fabric and you're going to cut those into 6.5 inch squares. All your blocks should now measure 6.5 inch squares. You're going to need 12 of these background fabrics. One of the things I thought of when I saw this quilt is that whenever you find a pattern that uses a background square, that's a really good quilt pattern if you want to put in an embroidery block, or sometimes we do memory quilts with photographs. And I just, a lot of times people are looking for patterns that are good for those. And if you have a pattern that calls for a background block, those are good quilts to insert those in, and the ones that we're looking for to make a little special. And so what you're going to need is 12 of these background squares, and then we get to put them together. So the layout is done in rows, and this one starts with the 9 patch fence rail, 9 patch fence rail, 9 patch fence rail, and the whole first row is that way. The second row is fence rail, background block, fence rail, background block, fence rail, background block. Try to say that fast 3 times. And that's how we do it. So let's just lay one out and show you how we do that. So I've got some 9 patches here. So a 9 patch and a fence rail. And the fence rails are on there sideways. And a 9 patch and a fence rail and a 9 patch. Okay, now this one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 blocks across. So you're going to put 7 across each row. Then the next row is going to be your fence rail. And this time we've turned it up, and your background block, and your fence rail, and your background block, and your fence rail. And you just keep doing that down the whole quilt. Now, once we get this middle part finished, we're going to take our background and cut 2.5 inch strips so we can do a first border. Then all these little pieces of squares that we had left over, we're going to sew together in one long piece to make this next outer border, which is really fun. I love when you're able to use up all your little scraps like that. So what you're going to do is you're just going to sew those together, one after the other, make a long strip of them. You'll put that on as the next border. Then again, you're going to add one more 2.5 inch border and your big border, which is 4 inches, and you're going to be good to go. This is just really a fun and enjoyable project. It's made with 2 easy blocks, and these blocks can make quilts all in their own right. So we hope you enjoyed this tutorial on the fence rail 9 patch from the Missouri Star Quilt Company.